Hi, and welcome to the basic data table video where we will look at three different types of data tables. We're going to use a very simple, very tangible model for this one. It's a course grade model, so it could be this course or some other. I don't think these are the weights I'll use in this course, but they're probably not too far off. And so if you had a participation score in a course and it was worth 10% of the grade, and let's say we participated really well and got a 92. On our quizzes, we did fairly well and got an 86, so it was worth 45% of the grade. On the project, we worked really hard and got a 91. And we don't know what we're going to do on the final, but we've got some other finals coming up, so let's see what would happen if we only got a 70 on the final. Allocate some time to some other courses. One thing we might want to check is that all these add up to 100. Now, a shortcut for that is to click on this cell and hit Alt and hold it down and hit equal. And Excel does a pretty good job of guessing what we might want to sum up. It says, well, there are 4 numbers above you. Maybe you want to sum those up. If there had been 4 numbers to the left, maybe it would have chosen those. I don't know. But it chose the right ones, and I'm going to hit Enter. And sure enough, it adds up to 100%. In fact, I'm going to select these 3 cells and do an Alt-H to go to Home, B to go to the borders, and P for a top border. And that will give me kind of a line to separate the inputs to the output. Speaking of which, since we don't know what we're going to make on the final yet, I'll do an Alt-H for Home, J for Cell Styles, and I will navigate down to Input to reflect that the final grade is a variable, and then the course grade is our output, so I'll do an Alt-H-J, navigate down to Output. Now I'm going to calculate this course grade. If I asked you to do it, you could say this number times this number plus this number times this number plus this, and so on. You could also look up a function called SumProduct. I have to spell it correctly, SumProduct, and take this array and this array, and it does the math that I just described. And so it gives us an 83.6. So if all I need is a B in the course, and I want to dedicate my time to other courses and see how much I can slack on this final, I could do an Alt-A-W-G and set cell D7 to an 80 by changing my final grade, and find out that I really only need about a 55, 56 on the final to get a B in the course. What if I wanted to see what various final grades would give me? Well, let's use a data table for that. My daughter helped me out, so I'm going to hit pause and bring in some of her work, like so. And so what she's doing in school is looking at function machines, where you put something in, there's a rule, and you get something out. Let's pretend like there were a function machine that the rule was x plus 1. So if I had a 5 going in and the rule was x plus 1, what would come out? If we weren't in an online class, everybody would be saying 6. If I put in an 8, I get out a 9. Since I'm recording a video, I have to talk to myself about this stuff. But anyway, let's say we did that for a while. We put in a 5, we got out a 6. We put in an 8, we got out a 9. We put in 121, we got out 122, because the rule were x plus 1. But what if the rule were take 25% of x and 75% of this weighted average to get what's coming out? Well, if we put in a 50, we'll get out a 78.6. If we put in a 60, we get an 81.1. I'm going to turn off the sound and do a few of these. And so if Madeline were doing this, she would have put a lot of numbers in. Those would have been her final. And she would have gotten a lot of numbers coming out. Those would have been her course grade. We're going to do the same thing over here with a data table, and I wish I would have saved one more row in there. So let me move this down a little bit, move this up so everything lines up. So we'll have a final and a course grade. And for our final under there, that's the input, we don't need anything. So I'm going to copy these cells with Control C, Control V. The course grade goes here. I know this seems completely arbitrary, but it'll make sense later on. Now, bear with me. I think for this semester, normally I ask students in class to let's vote on what color we want to call these things, because then the students have some ownership on it. I think this semester I'm going to change it around, and I'm going to use a format of output for whatever we're getting out. And I'm going to go ahead and use a format of input for whatever we're putting in. Now, here's how a data table works. You've seen this in a couple of previous videos. If you format those correctly, and then you select the cells to get all of the formatted cells, but only enough to get the formatted cells, pause the video and go back and listen to that. In fact, I'll say it again so you can rewind and hear it 4 times. Select enough cells to get all of the colored cells, but only enough to get the colored cells. Then you've selected the right amount. Do your Alt-AWG to go to A for data, W for what if analysis, T for data table. And then this little window pops up. It's a data table. It says, where would you like the row input or the column input cell to go? Now this will make more sense in a moment, but I'm going to put this column of inputs. That's why I chose to format them as inputs, because they're a column of inputs. Now what cell do I want to put them in? I want to put them in this cell. When I hit OK, I get the same outputs for course grade that we got when we did it the manual way. I get an output corresponding to each input that we put in, just like we did when we did it Madeline's way. And since this is a vertical list of numbers, I'm going to call this a one-dimensional vertical data table. From that name, you could probably guess that I could also do a one-dimensional horizontal data table. It would also have final and course grade. I'm going to do an Alt-HOI on that. And I could look at finals. I'm going to copy that and do an Alt-HVS for special. And I'm going to choose E down here for transpose and hit enter. And it will copy these and transpose, paste them there. So it brought the formatting with it. I'm going to type in my course grade. Oop, I didn't leave the obligatory blank. Got to have a room for that output. Got to have between my labels and my actual data table, I've got to have room for that output, just like I did up here. So I'm going to say equal the output. I'm going to format it, HJ, as an output. So notice between my labels and my inputs and outputs, I have a blank cell next to the inputs, and then I have the output here. So this is the transposed version of this. Labels, blank cell above the inputs, output cell above the outputs. It's just how Excel designed it. And by the way, look in here at this formula. It says it's got curly brackets, which means it's an array. We'll talk about that later in the course. It says equals table, and then your row input cell and your column input cell. You can't type that in here. I couldn't come in here and enter a table array formula. The only way I can do it, and back up the video and hear this 6 times now, is to select the colored cells. So I want to select enough cells to get the colored cells, but only enough cells to get all those colored cells. And then I'll do an Alt-A-W-T, or however you get to what if data tables. If you're on a Mac, it may be different. And then this time, my input cells are in a row. So instead of putting them in the column input cell, I'm going to put them in the row input cell. So I want those row input cells, I want Madeline with her little function machine over here to put them into D6. So the row input cell is D6. And then she can get the outputs out of this output cell. At this point in the video, I want to point out something. Pointing this at an output is convenient. We didn't really have to do that. I could take that whole formula, cut it with Control X, and then I could just put that formula in here. And notice how it's a sum product formula of all this stuff. All the data table's doing is taking whatever's in this cell and populating the function machine outputs, or over here, the function machine outputs. Ooh, I sure messed that one up because this one is still looking at a blank cell. I could put the same formula in there and do that. We don't typically do it that way. We like this to look at an output. We like this to look at an output. And then in the model itself, we like to actually do our calculations. So think of this as the model piece. This is the data table piece. If I started doing a bunch of calculations up here, it'd just make it harder to look at, but Excel wouldn't care. It would give us the same answers. So if I can do a 1D vertical and a 1D horizontal, you guessed it, I could also do a 2D data table. 2D data table. Why would I need to do a 2D data table? Well, let's say that I didn't know what my final grade was going to be, but also didn't know what my project grade was going to be. So if my final could range like that, my project, worked really hard on that project. I don't think I could make a 50 on it, but I might make an 80 or an 85 or a 90 or a 95 or 100. Format those with Alt-H-J as inputs. Now there's only one place left to put this output. So this function machine, I need to get Madeline to draw one with 2 arms over here because it's got 2 inputs and only 1 output. So I might do that in a future video. So the output here is still course grade. We'll do an Alt-H-J to indicate that that's the output in the data table. And we will select, back up the video, we'll select enough cells to get the colored cells, but only enough to get the colored cells. Okay, we don't need the labels. We don't need a bunch of extra cells out there. We need enough and only enough to get the colored cells. Then we hit our Alt-A-W-T. This thing pops up. Now we have a row input cells. That's our project grade. So we want to put the 80, 85, and so on into the project, which I should have colored as an input. I'll do that in a moment. And then we want our final exam grade, the 50 through 100, to go into here. And so when I say OK, we see all those combinations. Let me quickly Alt-H-J input. Okay, so now it says if I make an 80 on the project, but 100 on the final, I still can't get an A. But if I make a, let's see, if I make a 100 on the project and a 90 on the final, then I could still get an A. And so this shows all the different possibilities. So here again, when I look at the outputs of any of these, the formula is always going to be that table array formula, but I can't type that in. Some array formulas you could come in here and you could type in some formula, but you can't do it with a data table. It won't work because Excel literally loops through, in this case, 30 different runs of the model. Runs that function machine 30 different times. Up here it ran that function machine 6 times. And up here it ran it 6 times. So at the risk of repeating myself, this is what a data table does. I hope this video is something that you can refer to as we go throughout the semester. Now before I leave this video, I want to point out a couple of things. So our little function machine here had 1 input and 1 output, and that worked fine if we were doing a 1D vertical data table. We had an input and an output, and even on the horizontal we had an input and an output. Now when we came around to do the 2D data table, we actually had 2 inputs and 1 output. So Madeline's out getting a cat with her mom. I'm going to hit pause on this video and adjust this guy to show what he would look like down here. And now you can see why she's the artist in the family and I'm not. This new modified function machine has two arms to get inputs. So it takes this, let's say it takes an 80 and reaches up there and puts it in the project grade. Then it uses that other input arm to get the 50 and put it in the final grade. And it uses its output arm to reach up here and get the course grade and put it right there at 76. That corresponds with the 80 and the 50. Now I want to add a different type of function machine that has, instead of two input arms and one output arm, let's give it one input arm and two output arms and see what that would look like. And how might we adjust our model to have one input and two outputs? Well, we could say, go back and say our project grade was known, so we'll copy Alt HVST to format that as a known. But then let's come up with a second output, and this would be our strongest area, let's say. And so that'd just be the maximum of the different areas that make up our grade. So 92 was our strongest. And so strongest. I'm going to go ahead and do an Alt HOI here. Point this one at this output, which I guess also needs to be formatted. Alt HJ as an output. I'm going to do a Control Y to repeat, formatting that as an output. And then I want to say, so I need to rebuild this data table because now this little guy is reaching over here, getting the 50, put it in the final course grade, and then he's taking each of these two arms to get the course grade and the strongest area and fill this in. But what you need to do is come in here and select all the colored cells and only the colored cells. Do an Alt AWT, and we have not a row input cell, so I'll hit Tab to get down to a column input cell. If we had been working on this table, it would have been a row input cell. And so when we tell it we want you to put the column input cell with this arm in that final exam, click there and say OK. And it rebuilds our data table, this time with the strongest area. So only if we get a final exam grade of 100 does our strongest area become a 100. That's a pretty ridiculous thing to look at for an output, but it lets you see that you could calculate really as many as you want. You could have as many output arms over here as you want, and you could continue to add outputs out here to the right. Same thing down here, you could continue to add them to the bottom. So let's think about how could this work out. We could have one input with many outputs in both a vertical and a horizontal sense. But what about when we come to the 2D? If we can have at most two inputs, and when we do, we can only have one output. So hit pause, back up that little bit of text, and expect a question like that on the first quiz. Hopefully this video has been helpful. Have a great day.